Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and in today's tutorial I'm going to be showing you guys how to edit raw photos using a combination of GIMP and Darktable. I'm using GIMP version 2.10.6, which is the latest version of GIMP at the time of this tutorial, and I believe I'm also using the latest version of Darktable as well. So I do have an entire tutorial dedicated to installing Darktable and getting it connected with GIMP so that basically the two work sort of seamlessly the same way that Photoshop and Camera Raw work, and I explain Camera Raw and how it's basically an extension of Photoshop that's just been pre-built into Photoshop, whereas Darktable you just have to download it separately. Once you do have Darktable properly set up, it is pretty easy to open up your raw files into Darktable for processing and then export them as JPEGs into GIMP, where you can finish up any other edits you want to make to your image. But of course, before we get into all that, I want to direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, we have tons of GIMP video and text tutorials on here, as well as Project Translate. You can watch one of our GIMP playlists, support our channel on Patreon, and view our poll of the week results, so definitely check that out. You can also enroll in our GIMP photo editing course from beginner to pro photo retoucher on Udemy, and you can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon. I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So the photo we'll be using in today's tutorial is one that I took, and I'll make the photo available on our website, and of course I'll put that link in the description of the video. So let's go ahead and open up the original raw photo that I used. So this is my camera folder here, and here is the image I used. You can generally tell it's a raw photo versus a JPEG photo because raw photos are going to be a lot larger. The reason for this is that raw photos contain a lot more data than JPEGs do, because your camera essentially, when it takes photos in the raw format, is going to keep all of the data that it took for that image. So there's a lot more data there in the image versus a JPEG photo, which is basically processed within your camera, and therefore it's compressed within your camera. It's a smaller image size. There's not as much data there. And the benefits with that, with a raw image file, are that because there's more data, there's basically more parts of your image you could salvage. There's more flexibility there, more colors you could bring out in your final image, and basically you could just achieve a more high quality overall final image versus then if you just brought in a JPEG directly from your camera into something like GIMP. That's not to say that you can't achieve great photos with JPEGs. We do it all the time on this channel, but raw photos do allow you a little bit more flexibility, and it is sort of the professional standard for photographers when editing their photos because of the final results that they're able to achieve. All right, so what I'm going to do here with this raw photo is I'm going to right click and just go to Open With and choose GIMP. Again, I recommend you watch our tutorial on setting up Darktable with GIMP. All right, so now we have our photo open here in Darktable, and what I did is I had to go through here and sort of reset all the parameters. Basically what that's doing is it's resetting all of the settings of everything that I used for this image to make the original adjustment back to the default settings for Darktable. And by the way, I'm using Darktable version 2.4.3 if you guys were wondering. And so this is going to basically revert our image back to the original image. One feature with Darktable is that when you edit an image in Darktable, if you close it down, the next time you open up that raw file, all of the settings are going to be saved within Darktable, so it's going to open it up to the way you edited it last before you closed Darktable. And so I don't want to do that for this tutorial because I want to start over and show you guys the entire process from start to finish. And I'll give you a quick overview of Darktable real quick. I'm not going to get too much into it, but basically Darktable has several groups here. So you start with your basic group, you've got a tone group, color group, correction group, and effects group. And each of these groups has different modules, and you can come into these modules, and these modules allow you to make adjustments to your image. And then you can click down here for more modules, and whatever doesn't show up by default will be down in here. I've got some modules in here that you guys might not see on your version of Darktable. Again, you could just come down here to more modules and search for whatever module I'm using. I believe I know all of the modules that come within Darktable by default, but if I skip one, just keep that in mind. So I'm going to come over here to contrast brightness first, contrast brightness saturation, and that's pretty self-explanatory. This allows me to adjust the brightness, contrast, and saturation. There is a similar tool within GIMP which allows you to do the same thing. And something that I'm trying to avoid is too much of a haloing effect. I think it's kind of inevitable with this image, but you can see there's sort of an outline going around the brighter part of my image, and it's sort of a black halo in this case. And if I turn my settings up too much, it's going to basically cause that defect to stand out a little bit. So I'm trying to avoid making that halo too prominent, but I'm also going to turn up my saturation And I'm going to turn it up pretty high for now. We can always come back and adjust it down if we need to. And the rose looks pretty processed right now. That's another photo editing term that a lot of photographers use, photo editors use. And process just meaning that it looks sort of fake, looks a little bit too computerized, but we're going to tone that down in a little bit. But now we're going to come over here to our shadows highlights adjustment, and by default, Darktable is going to set your shadows and highlights to 50 and -50. So what I did was I sort of brought this in a little bit because I thought that these were a little bit too intense. And though I do want this image to be a little bit brighter, I don't want it to be overly bright or overly dark. And as you can see, by doing that, by making that adjustment, that halo has sort of gone away a little bit. It's still there, and it's going to be there probably for the final image, but we did manage to bring it down a little bit. And then I'm just going to shift my white point and see if that's going to help us get a better final image. And you'll see that as I shift my white point, the histogram over here is going to show your whites and your colors shifting either to the left or right. If it shifts to the left, that usually means your image is getting darker. If it shifts to the right, it's getting brighter. So I'm just going to shift the white point a little bit negative there, and we'll just leave that there for now. I'm going to leave these other settings the same, and I'm just going to skip over to exposure, and I'll just play around with this. Basically what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to adjust how bright the image is. So if I turn the exposure up, it'll make the image a little bit brighter, especially with the highlights. And then I can also adjust the black, which is going to adjust how many black pixels are in the image. And that's sort of another way of adjusting your brightness contrast to a degree. So I'm going to start by adjusting the exposure down a little bit and see how that looks. And then I'll adjust it up a little bit, see how that looks. This is something that I do pretty often. I just sort of adjust things up or down and see how they look. If you have a pretty obvious error, like there's just overexposed parts of your image all over the place, it's going to be pretty obvious that you need to turn the exposure down a little bit. In my case, I have a bright spot on this little stack of snow here on the flower, and so I probably will need to turn the exposure down a little bit. And then I can adjust my black pixels. Again, I'll just go back and forth, so you'll see if I put this to the left, there's less black pixels, and that's causing our image to look a little bit brighter, but also have a little bit less contrast and sort of look washed out. Or if I bring it to the right a little bit, our photo gets a little bit darker, but also has a little bit of contrast added in there. So there's a before and there's an after. You can also see our histogram sort of shifted a little bit, and it almost became a little bit more evenly distributed across the graph, and that's usually a good sign depending on what you're going for. Now I'm going to come over to the white balance, and this is going to allow me to sort of adjust the overall color of the image. So there are several approaches to the color temperature of your image, and it's ultimately going to depend on your personal preference as to how the final temperature turns out, whether you want to cool it off or warm it up. But ultimately, when you cool something off, it'll become more blue, and when you warm it up, it'll become more of an orangish color. In this case, because I took this photo on a cold day when it was snowing, what I want to do is cool this down a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit of blue to this by turning down the temperature, and you guys will see the final result of that, but I'm not going to overdo it, of course. So I'll come over here to temperature, and I'm just going to turn it down slightly, and you'll see that the image starts to look a little bit colder as I do that, and it almost looks like a night photo if I do it too much. So you'll see if I go all the way to the left, it starts to look a little bit too intense for me, a little bit too fake. But if I come over here, I can reset the parameters so I can put this back to what it looked like originally. But now I'm just going to come over here, and it was set to about 54 Kelvin before. I'm going to put this just below 5,000, and 5,400 Kelvin is what I meant. I'm just going to set this to a little bit under 5,000. You'll see that'll cool this off just slightly without overdoing it, and we'll just leave that there. So now I'm going to come over here to our tone group, and here we have some options like a fill light, and the fill light is basically adding a little bit of light inside your image. And actually, because we do have sort of this overexposed area here, and I'll reset this parameter, I'm just going to leave the fill light out for now for this photo because I don't think that it's really going to make a huge difference, and I certainly don't think it's going to make this photo a lot better by having it. So I'm just going to leave it out for now, and if we need it later, we can come back to it. So the next module here is levels. This is just like the levels tool in GIMP. It just allows you to adjust the shadows, midtones, and highlights in your image. It's called different here. It's called black, gray, and white. but it's basically accomplishing the same thing as the levels tool would do in GIMP. So you can just drag these triangles here, and that allows you to adjust your levels. And you can see here's a before and here's an after. So I'm just going to close that down. And here is the tone curve. And the tone curve is basically just like the curves tool within GIMP. So what you can do here is you can just create an S curve like you would in GIMP, and that is going to create some contrast. So you can see now there's a lot more contrast in our image. And you also have the ability to edit different channels. So this is your lightness channel. You can also edit the red-green channel here, which is A, and then B stands for the blue-yellow channel. I'm not going to go through those for this tutorial, but you can see here is a before and here's an after, so we just added a little bit of contrast there. Now I'm going to skip over here to the color group, and I'm going to leave out Velvia. That's actually a module that I pulled out of the More Modules section. It's not usually here by default. But I'm just going to skip over to color contrast, and this allows you to increase the contrast between these sets of colors, so the green versus magenta and the blue versus the yellow. So you'll see that as I turn this up, the greens will stand out a little bit more from the magentas in the image. I don't want to overdo it because our rose is being affected by that, and we don't want this rose looking like some artificial light bulb or something. And then you can also test out the blue and yellow contrast there, so you'll see the blue popped out. So the more you turn this to the right, the more contrast there will be. And so here's a before and here's an after, very subtle difference there. And so I'll just move on to our next module. So the color correction module allows you to obviously correct the colors in your image, but it also allows you to achieve something called split toning. And that is basically when you assign different colors to your shadows and highlights. So the white dot here is going to be your highlights, and you'll see that when I move this, there is a black dot that appears behind it. The black dot is going to be the colors assigned to your shadows. So I want my highlights to have more of the warm color here, so like the orange-ish yellow colors. And then I want my shadows to have more of those blue colors. So you'll see that as I do that, it creates a pretty cool effect, a little bit of contrasting between the colors. You can also move these over a little bit to the left. So as I move it over more this way, it's going to become more green. If I move it more this way, it's going to become more of a magenta or pinkish color. I don't want too much green in here, but I also don't want too much of the magentas or the pinks. So I'll go with that right there, and you can see here is a before and here is an after. So it's just kind of changed the structure of the colors of our shadows and highlights. You can also come down here to saturation and turn up your saturation if you'd like. That to me is just blowing out the colors and it's making it way too colorful, so I'm just going to keep that at 1. And plus we don't really need this because in the next step we have color zones. This is another module that I pulled out of the More Modules section. So just scroll down until you get to the color zones module. And this looks kind of weird and complicated at first, but it's actually really cool and really simple. So I'm going to come over here and start with my lightness. So what this is doing is it's allowing me to adjust the lightness, saturation, and hue of the various colors in my image. And I can do that using this curve here, so this will be a curve as we edit it. You can also see there's this big circle around my mouse pointer, and I can increase or decrease that using the wheel on my mouse. And what that is doing is it's saying that whatever colors I'm adjusting with this curve, the colors within the circle around my mouse pointer will also be affected by the adjustment. So I'm just going to shrink that down a little bit because I don't want too many of the neighboring colors getting affected by our adjustments. But this, remember, is adjusting our lightness. So this is going to adjust how bright or dark basically a color is going to be. Versus saturation is going to adjust the intensity of a color, and then hue is going to adjust the color itself. So I'm going to start over here with like my reddish pinks, and you'll see that as I adjust the reds here, the pinks over here, or the pinkish reds, get adjusted at the same time. So this actually comes back around and these are the same color. So you could toy around with this, and you'll see that as I do that, the red loses a little bit of that intensity that it had before. So here's a before and here is an after, and that just allows us to sort of make this red look a little bit more real, a little bit more believable, and look more like a rose versus having it look like some fluorescent light bulb. And we could do the same with all of the colors here in our image. So we could just sort of move down the line. And here you'll see that we start to get into our yellows and our greens. So right here, the colors in our leaves are being affected a little bit more. And as I adjust the green, you'll see that the colors here are definitely affected now. So now we have a little bit brighter greens going on here, which looks pretty cool. And you can either add some lightness to the blues or you could take away some of the lightness to the blues. I'm just going to take some away because they are a little bit intense right now. And then as we start to circle back around to our reds, you can increase or decrease the lightness of those colors. So I think that looks pretty cool right there. So now we can switch over to saturation, and same thing, you can increase or decrease the saturation of the colors instead of the lightness. So we can go down the line here with our curve and we can just increase or decrease the value on this curve. So I could turn up the saturation of those leaves to help them stand out a little bit more. And that helps them sort of fit the brightness of the red in our rose petals. And there are a lot of blues in my image, and that's why I'm sort of decreasing the saturation of them because I don't want the blues to be overpowering and again make the image look artificial. So here is a before. So you'll see our rose looks a little bit artificial, looks like a fluorescent color or something, almost like neon. And then here's an after, so we've tamed that color down a little bit without taking away too much of the red, while also enhancing the green in our leaves. So I'm going to skip over color balance and I'm just going to head straight to Vibrance. Essentially what Vibrance does is it increases the saturation of the colors in our image, but it also does that while taking away any of the lightness that is increased as a result of increasing that saturation. So basically, instead of having very saturated colors that are super bright, you just get the saturation portion and it's going to take out the lightness so it doesn't look too artificial. So this is a very popular tool because the results are pretty cool. It does help to bring out the colors. So I'm just going to turn the vibrance up a little bit and we'll put it to about right there. I'm going to skip over the input color profile and I'm just going to head straight to the next group, which is the correction group. And now I'm going to go to Sharpen, and this of course is going to allow us to sharpen our picture. So I'm just going to turn the radius up a little bit and then I'm just going to turn up the amount. So I'm just going to keep this a pretty subtle effect because I don't want to overdo anything. So I'll go with right there. And I'm not going to get into these other modules because I do think that my final image here already was pretty crisp, so I don't need to mess with the equalizer, denoise, or lens correction, but just know you do have these modules right here. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with the way our colors have turned out with the edits we've made to this raw file in Darktable. So now what I'm going to do is open this up into GIMP, and what that's going to do is it's going to process this, or it's going to compress this into a JPEG file, and then GIMP will be able to open it, and then from there we can make some finishing touches and then go ahead and export that, and we could share the final JPEG or whatever final file we want to export this as wherever we want to save this. So to open this up into GIMP, all I have to do is close down our image, and you'll see a progress bar here, and this has opened our image up into GIMP. You'll see there's probably some slight difference here in the colors, and this is just because each time I edit a photo I do it differently. So now what I'm going to do is come over here to my measure tool, and I'm going to just draw a line right here. This is supposed to be a straight line, so we're just double checking that this image is straightened. If not, click the straighten option, and that will straighten this image based on that line we chose. And then what I'm going to do is just crop this out so that we crop out anything we don't want from this image, including the transparency that was just created from straightening this. So grab my crop tool, and you could choose to have this set to a fixed aspect ratio, or in this case I'm just going to freehand draw this. I don't really care what the final aspect ratio is. So I just clicked and dragged with my crop tool, and I'm just going to hold Control and zoom in, and I'm going to set the crop so that it does not include any of this transparency here. And I'll hold the space bar to move across my image, hold Control, zoom in with my mouse wheel, and just make sure there's no transparency here. So right there should be good. And I'm just cropping out a little bit of the white part here because I just don't like that, but I do want to keep a little bit of it in there. And then we could change our guide style within our crop tool itself. So I'm going to change this to rule of thirds, and that's going to allow me to sort of center up the flower here, the rose, but it's also going to allow me to use the rule of thirds to see where the stem is on this rose. So I'm going to go with about right there, and then double click to crop. I'll hold Control and zoom in, and then just use my spacebar to recenter the image. Next, what I'll do is just scale this down because I don't need the image to be quite so large. I could export this as this large image if I wanted to, but I'm just going to go to Image, Scale Image, and I'm just going to choose 1920 and hit the Tab key. and that will scale this down to 1223 just by keeping the aspect ratio here. And make sure that interpolation is set to no halo, and I'll hit scale. I'll hold control and zoom in a little bit. So next what I want to do is just try to tone down some of the overexposed parts right here on our image. So to do that, I'll just go to Colors, Shadows, Highlights, and I'm just going to crank the highlights down a little bit. And you'll see that as I do that, some of the details are going to return right here in these way overexposed parts. So here's a before and here's an after. It's also toned down some of the glow that was happening right here near the rose. And that's all I'm going to do really here, so I'll just click OK. And just a couple last steps. So next what I want to do is add a vignette. So I'll create a new layer, and I'll just name this Vignette. And I'll click OK. And the reason I'm putting the vignette on its own separate layer, apart from just having a little bit more control over the vignette, is because I do want to add a light source to this, and I want that light source to go underneath the vignette. So anyway, I'm going to click on my vignette layer and go to Filters, Light and Shadow, Vignette. So the radius is going to determine how far in on the center of our image this vignette is going to close in. So we can go with about right there. The softness is going to be the edge of the vignette, basically. It's going to determine how far out that vignette is going to fade, essentially. And then gamma is going to adjust the edge of the fade. So the less the gamma is, you'll see the stronger the edge of that fade is going to be. And I probably didn't explain that perfectly, but you guys can just sort of see for yourselves what it's doing. And I want a pretty subtle vignette here, so I'm not going to overdo this effect by any means, much like a lot of things I do in image editing. And once I have the vignette I like, I'll just click OK. And lastly, what I'm going to do is just add a little bright spot here, almost like a little light source. So I'll just create a new layer and name this light source. And make sure your fill width is set to transparency, and I'll click OK. And now I'm just going to move that below the vignette layer. I'm going to take our paintbrush tool. Make sure you have a pretty large brush. So right now I have this set to almost 1,000. And then I also have the hardness set way down to 6.6. And make sure your color is set to white. And then what I did is I just sort of clicked a little bit above where you could see the bright spot on our snow. And that just created this little light source here. And then I can just go to Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just blur that source a little bit. And I'll click OK. And it just looks like a little beam of light is coming in from the top of our image. You could turn the opacity down of this layer to make it a little bit more or less intense. So I'm going to go with about right there. And I do actually want to turn our vignette down a little bit, which is one of the benefits of putting it on its own layer. And there we go. So now, of course, we can export this to a JPEG by going to File, Export As, and I'll just rename this. And you'll see I can actually export this as a raw photo, but I'm just going to export this as a JPEG. Select my location and then click Export. Choose my quality, so I'll turn it all the way up and hit Export again. And there you go. Alright, so that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you guys liked it. If you did, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. You can also visit our website at daviesmediadesign.com. You can enroll in our GIMP photo editing course from beginner to pro photo retoucher on Udemy, and you can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon. And I'll include a link to that as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.